Legend has it that the moment Joan Marie Larkin first laid her hands on a guitar, an electric shock of possibility sparked through her, quietly foreshadowing the seismic waves she'd soon send rippling through the rock and roll world. Though she was born in Wynwood, Pennsylvania, her earliest years weren't exactly spent center stage in the glare of the spotlight. She was just a kid from Maryland to West Covina, California, trying to figure out who she was in a landscape filled with the usual teenage angst, her parents' divorce, and a burning desire to make some kind of noise. By the time she was 13, she had her own guitar, a gift that might have seemed almost trivial at first. Maybe it was her father's way of supporting her budding interests, or maybe it was simply a whim that turned out to be game-changing. However it came about, this was no ordinary teenage hobby. We're talking about a young girl who had zero interest in folky sing-alongs. As soon as her guitar teacher tried to stuff her full of old-fashioned ballads, she realized that the polite kumbaya route was not for her. So, like the fierce rebel she'd proved to be, she simply quit the lessons and taught herself in the style she adored, raw, gritty rock, with a dash of glam and a streak of punk attitude. You can almost imagine that early scene. A teenage Joan, dyed hair, or brash clothes not quite in place yet, but an unflinching spirit already forming in her eyes, fumbling with power chords in her bedroom. That same spark would drive her to legally change her name to Joan Jett in the 1980s. It wasn't just a marketing ploy or an attempt to escape personal history. Jett was her mother's maiden name, and as the family reconfigured after her parents' divorce, it felt symbolic to take that piece of her heritage and wear it as armor. Joan Jett sounded defiant, unstoppable, and maybe just a bit dangerous, and that was precisely what she wanted the world to see. That sense of rebellion was amplified by an unlikely teacher outside of her home, Rodney Bingenheimer's English disco. The very name might conjure images of a glitzy in-crowd hangout on the Sunset Strip, and that's exactly what it was. Frequented by glam rock icons, proto-punk visionaries, and a suspiciously large crowd of teenage girls, the club was a cradle for a new kind of musical and cultural revolution. The English disco was also peppered with edgy characters like Iggy Pop or members of the Gun Club, not to mention major record producers who, behind closed doors, were scanning for fresh young faces to mold. Joan Jett, still a teenage girl, found herself drawn to the pounding glam beats and the androgynous style. The club became her after-school playground. Instead of pep rallies, she was crossing paths with Kim Fowley, a local impresario with a questionable reputation and an eye for sensational acts. The environment was raucous, seductive, and not exactly PG rated, but it lit a bonfire under Jett's creative spark. Kim Fowley himself was a notorious figure who could impress you one second and horrify you the next. He saw potential in raw, wild teenage talent, particularly the girls milling around the English disco. Among these hopefuls was Sandy West, an aspiring drummer who had the same no-holds-barred energy that Joan was cultivating. When Sandy mentioned her dream of forming an all-girl rock band, Fowley handed her Joan Jett's number. It was almost like fate, that intangible cosmic push that happens when two unstoppable forces meet. One phone call led to a jam session, which led to a flurry of raw riffs and half-finished tunes. Suddenly they had enough momentum to bring in more members. Jackie Fox on bass, Lita Ford on guitar, and Cherie Currie on vocals, and occasional keyboards. Bam! The Runaways were born. If you only see them now in retro photos, with teased hair, leather jumpsuits, and teen scowls, it's hard to grasp the shock factor they brought in the mid-1970s. A gaggle of teenage girls playing blistering rock music was not just unusual, it was downright scandalous. Critics didn't know what to do with them. Fans were a mix of devoted groupies and outraged moralists, but they had a rawness that was impossible to ignore. Kim Fowley, doing what he did best, helped push them into the spotlight. He wasn't shy about coaching them with questionable techniques like hosting heckling drills where grown men would be invited into rehearsals to throw things and shout insults just to toughen these teenage girls up. It sounds horrific, but Joan later insisted it actually helped her. If she could endure that level of raw hostility, she could handle anything from a crowd, and handle it she did. With Mercury Records behind them, the Runaways released their debut album in 1976 and started making noise. Loud, raucous noise. In the midst of this girl-powered storm, a teenage Joan Jett was forging her persona. She dyed her hair black, wore a fiery red leather jumpsuit that would become iconic, and tried to emulate her own hero, Suzi Quatro. Quatro was known for her no-nonsense attitude, ripping bass lines, and a rebellious streak that perfectly matched Jett's aspirations. But even with these influences, Jett was rapidly becoming her own phenomenon. People took note. When the Runaways found themselves on tour in England, Jett got booked to appear on a variety show hosted by the band Arrows. That was the fateful day she first heard them perform I Love Rock and Roll, a song that stuck in her mind like superglue. She probably had no idea it would later become her signature, the track that would smash radio charts and define her brand for decades. Life has a funny way of throwing you these random seeds, and I Love Rock and Roll was a seed that would grow into a monstrous, unstoppable beanstalk. But the Runaways themselves, while dynamic, faced constant hurdles. They were bigger in Japan than they ever were in the United States, famously outselling some of the biggest acts of the time, yes, even Kiss and ABBA, on Japanese soil. American critics either dismissed them or moralized about how these teenage girls were being exploited. And behind the scenes, tensions brewed like a storm. Cherie Currie eventually left, frustrated by the direction and the infighting. Joan Jett suddenly found herself front and center, taking over lead vocals entirely. They recorded 2 more albums, but the strain was obvious. By New Year's Eve of 1978, the Runaways called it quits, undone by poor commercial reception, internal creative battles, and a music industry that just didn't know how to handle 5 rebellious teenage girls. The official demise of the Runaways might have been a heartbreak for fans, but it was also a freeing moment for Joan Jett. Freed from a band that never quite gelled with mainstream America, she was now able to pivot in a new direction. She was approached by a group of Runaways fans calling themselves the Germs, a chaotic but groundbreaking punk band in the Bay Area hardcore scene. They asked her to produce their album GI. She said yes, stepping behind the console for the first time. That 1979 record would become a cult classic, revered for its raw energy. Joan Jett wasn't just a performer anymore. She was a producer, an architect of sound, shaping the next generation of punk misfits. This might have been the earliest sign that Jett's legacy would extend far beyond singing on a stage, but that's not to say her stage days were behind her. In fact, they were just beginning in a new form. She ended up in England for a spell, working on a solo album, hooking up with the Sex Pistols, Steve Jones, and Paul Cook to record an early version of I Love Rock and Roll. She came back stateside and continued to collab, this time with Clem Burke and Frank Infante from Blondie. Meanwhile, she had a cameo in a weird film project about the Runaways that never came to proper fruition, and wrote music with Eddie Laguna, a former Shondells guitarist. All these puzzle pieces were in flux, swirling around, until she decided to pull them together into her own unstoppable force. That force would soon be known as Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. The path to that band, however, wasn't straightforward. Major labels showed no interest in Jett's newly minted solo material. She was repeatedly rejected by an eye-popping 23 different labels. Imagine the frustration. She had star power, a unique image, a proven track record, and a set of rock tunes that could ignite a radio station, yet label executives collectively shrugged. So Jett, never one to take no for an answer, founded her own label, Blackheart Records, in 1980. It was a radical move for a woman in that era. She became the first woman in history to own and operate her own independent record label. Today, when artists talk about going indie, it's relatively common, but back then it was groundbreaking. With producer and collaborator Eddie Laguna in her corner, she pressed her own records, selling them from the trunk of a car after shows, hustling in a way that predicted the DIY ethos of future punk and hip-hop generations. One of those early efforts was an album initially titled simply Joan Jett. In a typical example of the meddling and marketing that big labels love, Boardwalk Records eventually picked it up for wider distribution, but insisted on changing the name to Bad Reputation, after the single that seemed to capture Jett's defiant persona. The bad reputation might have been half marketing, half truth, but it fit like a glove. Over time, Bad Reputation became one of Jett's most beloved tracks, used in everything from pop culture references to the theme of the cult classic TV show Freaks and Geeks. It also sits near the top of countless greatest rock songs lists, a testament to Jett's ear for creating anthems that speak to the outsider in us all. She's often cited it as her personal favorite, but of course the greatest commercial apex was still ahead. The album I Love Rock and Roll arrived in December 1981, just in time for the holiday season, hence its inclusion of a rendition of the Christmas carol Little Drummer Boy. The single itself, I Love Rock and Roll, was originally meant as a B-side for her cover of Leslie Gore's You Don't Own Me. Fate had different plans. Radio DJs flipped that record over, gave I Love Rock and Roll a spin, and a phenomenon was born. It rocketed to number one, lodged itself there, and became an anthem that continues to define an entire generation's understanding of good, old-fashioned, guitar-driven rock. By the late 80s, Jett had proven that she wasn't a one-hit wonder. She dropped the single I Hate Myself for Loving You, co-written with Desmond Child and featuring a cameo guitar solo from the Rolling Stones' Mick Taylor. The track soared into the top 10, spending even more total weeks on the chart than I Love Rock and Roll. For a woman who had been rejected by nearly every label in existence, it was sweet validation, proof that her brand of gutsy rock with a rebellious spirit had legs that could carry it through changing trends. Later, the song even re-entered the charts in 2011, a testament to its enduring power and that unstoppable Jett persona. Jett's unstoppable presence in music wasn't just about chart positions and record sales. She emerged as a figurehead for feminist punk and rock, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, when the Riot Grrrl movement began shaking up the underground scene. Bands like L7, Bikini Kill, and Babes in Toyland hailed her as a pioneer. A woman who had stared down a male-dominated industry, refused to be silenced, and opened doors for the next wave of loud, unapologetic women in rock. She produced Bikini Kill's second album, offering them a guiding hand much as she had done for the Germs, and she signed quite a few of these feminist punk acts to her Blackheart Records imprint, proving she wasn't just a musician, she was a mentor and gate opener, paying forward the scrappy lessons she'd learned the hard way as a teenage runaway. In 2004, a documentary called Edge Play, a film about the Runaways, threatened to drag old tensions back into the open. Joan Jett wanted nothing to do with it, believing it would focus on controversies rather than the music. she withheld her songs from the documentary, effectively forcing the filmmakers to avoid her classic tracks. Years later, a more official take on the story emerged with The Runaways, 2010, starring Kristen Stewart as Joan Jett and Dakota Fanning as Cherie Currie. This time, Jett was fully on board, even working closely with Stewart, so the actress could absorb her mannerisms and approach to performance. Stewart tried singing as well, and while Jett praised her vocals, in the end, Jett herself recorded the guitar parts for the soundtrack. The final product brought renewed attention to the band's legacy and to Jett's role as a teen prodigy turned rock icon. Interestingly, the documentary about the Germs, What We Do Is Secret, also included a depiction of Joan, played by Anna Waronker, proving once again that Jett's fingerprints are all over key moments in punk history. As the 90s turned into the 2000s, Jett branched out in other ways too. She became an outspoken voice for animal rights, embracing vegetarianism in the 1990s, and later aligning with PETA to advocate for better treatment of animals. This might seem like a surprising turn for the rebellious rocker who once had zero problem being labeled bad, but her personal moral code simply expanded to champion vulnerable creatures. And if you think about her rebellious streak, it makes sense. She's always been the type to stand up for the underdog, whether that's an all-girl band in a sea of male competition or animals who can't speak for themselves. Her personal life carried heartbreak and challenges that fans sometimes only learned about years later. She went through what she calls a decade of death in the 2000s, losing many loved ones in a short span. Perhaps the most devastating was the death of her father in 2007, followed by her mother 2 years later. Despite her dad's initial skepticism about rock and roll, he openly disliked the genre. He had grudgingly supported Joan's dream, even helping buy her first guitar when she was just a kid. That small act of support meant the world to her, and she never forgot it. Losing him and then her mother left her feeling adrift, fueling a sense of fragility that seeped into her music. Tracks like Fragile, she says, were born out of that deep sense of mortality, the realization that even the toughest hearts can break. All the stadium anthems and adoring fans can't negate the simple, raw pain of losing the people who raised you. Throughout it all, Jett maintained her love of sports, a less discussed aspect of her life. She was invited by Baltimore Orioles shortstop Cal Ripken Jr. to sing the national anthem on the night he tied Lou Gehrig's consecutive games record. Imagine the adrenaline of that moment. A rock and roll queen stepping onto a baseball diamond in front of tens of thousands of fans, bridging the worlds of sports and music. It's a testament to the strange and magical cross appeal of Joan Jett. She resonates with punks, pop lovers, Riot Grrrls, glam rockers, baseball fans, and pretty much anyone who loves a no-nonsense approach to living out your dreams. But let's step back in time for a moment to that infamous English disco, where an underage Joan Jett once rubbed elbows with the wild side of rock. The stories from that place are legendary, like the time Iggy Pop fell on a piece of broken glass, injuring himself mid-performance, and the crowd egged him on in that twisted glam punk atmosphere. To young Joan, that was normal. The loud music, the bodily risks, the sense that anything could happen at any moment. It might sound terrifying, but it also fired her imagination. She saw the extremes of rock culture up close and realized that if these misfits and weirdos could command a stage, she could too. That's the thread tying it all together. Joan Jett grew up in chaos, found her voice in defiance, and harnessed that energy into a career spanning decades. And indeed, decades later, she's still at it. In 2013, she released Unvarnished, an album that landed in the Billboard Top 50. From a purely commercial perspective, that's an impressive showing for someone who could have been considered a nostalgic relic of the 80s. Instead, she remains relevant, bridging generations. In 2014, she stepped onto the stage with the surviving members of Nirvana during their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, filling the role of Kurt Cobain for a performance that sent chills down the spines of everyone who watched. Dave Grohl later reminisced about the emotional weight of having Joan Jett, a childhood hero for so many, stand in to sing Nirvana songs. The following year, she joined the Hall of Fame in her own right, inducted alongside her band, the Blackhearts. It was a long time coming, but Jett never seemed one to hanker for the establishment's approval. She told interviewers that the recognition was nice, but not the core of why she made music in the first place. And for anyone who doubts her cultural footprint, consider the tributes and parodies. Weird Al Yankovic lampooned I Love Rock and Roll with I Love Rocky Road, a comedic homage that introduced new fans to Jett's big riff. Even the comic strip Bloom County included a character named Tess Turbo, clearly inspired by Jett's aesthetic and presence. This is the intersection of pop culture and serious rock credibility that few artists navigate so successfully. She's one part renegade, one part mainstream symbol, standing at the crossroads of multiple generations who can all recite I Love Rock and Roll by heart. Her knack for covers has also been a defining element of her artistry. She doesn't shy away from reinterpreting other artists' work, whether it's Sly and the Family Stone, Tommy James and the Shondells, Bruce Springsteen, or the Arrows. That alone demonstrates her broad musical appetite. She loves rock and roll, sure, but she also loves a good song, period, no matter the genre or the original intention. If she can mold it into her style and deliver it with that gravelly, commanding voice, she will. Interestingly, she's also had cameo appearances in the sports world beyond the national anthem gig. While it might not make the same headlines as her shows, she's performed at a number of events that cross the boundary between music and athletics, further proving that rock and roll can unify a stadium in the same way as a great baseball game. And that's always been her strength. Bridging divides, ignoring the naysayers, and cutting directly to the heart of what matters. Loud guitars, honest lyrics, and raw emotion. If there's a repeated theme in Joan Jett's story, it's that she never accepted the limitations others tried to impose on her. Time and again, she hit walls, like the 23 label Rejections. But she plowed ahead anyway, birthing an entire label out of pure necessity. She endured the dissolution of the Runaways, who had faced so much pushback that they barely scratched the U.S. market. She endured the scorn of managers, critics, and even her own father's disapproval of rock and roll. Each blow only seemed to fuel her rebellious spirit further. Some years after the Runaways ended, Kim Fowley tried to replicate their success with another all-girl hard rock band called the Orchids, but it never achieved the same spark. There was only one group of rebellious teenage girls that really broke the mold, and that was the Runaways. Even if they never saw mainstream acceptance in their prime, their influence, especially Jett's portion of it, echoed for generations. It would be impossible to tell the story of women in rock without discussing the Runaways, and by extension, Joan Jett's pivotal role. Despite the negative press, the Runaways found a devoted international audience, especially in Japan, where the mania was real. Even after they parted ways, the import sales of their records soared in the U.S., testament to that underground hunger for something raw and different. Their live album, recorded at Tokyo's Well City Concert Hall, was originally designated for release only in Asia and Australia. But fans in the States prized it so much that it became one of the most imported records of its time. This phenomenon predicted the cult status the Runaways would later enjoy, with fans around the world scavenging for vinyl pressings or obscure footage from their tours. More than simply a teenage novelty act, the Runaways planted seeds for the robust female rock presence that would flourish decades later. Jett's career after the group ended wasn't entirely free of controversy either. There were those who felt she relied too heavily on covers, or that her image was too contrived. But the more she was challenged, the more fervently she stuck to her guns. She even ventured into acting, starring in movies like We're All Crazy Now, originally intended for the Runaways, and later Light of Day, alongside Michael J. Fox. While these didn't necessarily catapult her to Hollywood stardom, they showcased her willingness to explore creative avenues. She never wanted to be pigeonholed as just a guitarist or just a singer. She had an entrepreneurial mind, launching Blackheart Records, championing new bands, producing and generally orchestrating her own path through an industry that offered few mentors for someone like her. Back in the 1970s, Kim Fowley might have been an exploitative mentor for the Runaways, but Joan herself took a different approach to mentorship. When the Riot Grrrl movement exploded, championing feminist ideals and do-it-yourself ethics, Jett didn't stand off to the side. She jumped right in, endorsing, signing, and producing these new acts. She was particularly close with Bikini Kill, a band that shook up the early 90s with pointedly feminist lyrics and an incendiary stage presence. Jett lent her experience, star power, and studio know-how, directly shaping the next generation. If Kim Fowley had once forced teenage girls to endure humiliating heckling drills, Jett was now the older sister or godmother figure who would never let the next wave of female rockers face the same struggles without a supportive hand. It's no wonder they call her the Queen of Rock and Roll. It's not just a reference to her big hits or her signature black hair bad girl look. It's because she fought for her throne every step of the way, from that teenage dream in the English disco to her hard rock induction. For all the rebellious posture, Jett displays a deep sense of loyalty. She's loyal to the fans who stuck with her, loyal to the memory of those who supported her early on, loyal to the animals she defends, and loyal to the idea that rock and roll is bigger than corporate marketing or fleeting trends. She said before that rock and roll is about rebellion and passion, about speaking to the disenfranchised. And you can see that authenticity in the way she carries herself. Even her stage garb, that famous leather and occasional jumpsuit, is more uniform than costume. She's a soldier for the cause of rock. Her father's skepticism could have crushed her in those formative years, but she turned it into fuel. Knowing he didn't like rock yet, still chipped in for her guitar, might have been the earliest example of that classic dynamic she's carried into every relationship. I might not like what you're doing, but I respect your right to do it. She took that principle and extended it to every corner of her career, from bridging pop and punk audiences to throwing her weight behind teen punks who had something vital to say. In an industry that chews people up and spits them out, it's remarkable that Joan Jett is still performing, still releasing records, and still relevant. Many rock icons from her era have settled into nostalgia tours, playing greatest hits at county fairs. Jett does play her classics, of course, and the crowd goes wild for them. But she also invests in new music, tours with living legends like The Who, and inserts herself into cultural events where she can remain a voice that truly matters. Take, for instance, her role opening for The Who's 50th anniversary tour in 2015. This isn't just about nostalgia. It's a sign of mutual respect between two pillars of rock history. Way back in the day, The Who had let her use their studio on a sort of pay-us-when-you-can basis, an unspoken endorsement that helped jumpstart her career. Nearly 40 years later, she's still connected enough to them and to the industry to share that stage on their golden anniversary. One thing that's consistently overshadowed by her image is her genuine skill as a guitarist. Rolling Stone once included her among the top 100 rock guitarists of all time, a distinction that might still catch some people off guard, simply because her persona often dominates the conversation. When you think of Joan Jett, you might picture the dark eye makeup and the tough stance, or you might recall her iconic tracks. But behind that front is a musician who fought relentlessly to teach herself the guitar, who overcame teachers telling her to play folk songs, and who honed her craft until it was worthy of the best of lists. That's part of the reason her covers stand out. She can take a simple chord progression and inject it with her signature roar, both vocally and instrumentally, turning a half-remembered tune into a thunderous anthem of rebellion. But there's a tenderness in her story too, especially around the time she lost both parents in quick succession. Some fans might not have realized how close she was to them, given her self-styled image as a leather-clad rocker. Yet the heartbreak she experienced translated into introspective songs that revealed a more vulnerable side. That sense of loss, she admitted, gave her perspective on how fragile life is, how quickly everything can slip away, and how desperately we cling to the few things we truly love. While I Love Rock and Roll is the big crowd pleaser, the quieter reflection in tracks like Fragile is just as authentic to who Joan Jett is as an artist. Her activism extends beyond animal rights and feminism. She's also been supportive of LGBTQ+ causes, although she tends to keep her personal life private. That air of mystery about her dating or relationships never overshadowed her main passion, the music. She's repeatedly stated in interviews that the music itself should be center stage. That's the legacy she wants to leave, a blueprint for how to be a rebellious spirit who always returns to the raw power of a great riff. So if anyone out there still questions why she matters, just listen. Listen to that crunch of the guitar riff when I Love Rock and Roll kicks in, or the rebellious snarl of Bad Reputation. Listen to the stories of young women who picked up guitars because of her example, or the punk bands that found a champion in her studio. Listen to the heartbreak in her quieter tracks, born of real-life loss, and the unstoppable drive in her performance every time she steps onto a stage. What you'll hear is a life of perseverance, passion, and pure rock energy, channeled into a timeless persona that still resonates today. That's why we can't stop talking about Joan Jett, the black-hearted queen who refused to bow, who's been rocking for decades and shows no signs of stopping. Because in a music world full of fleeting fads and passing obsessions, she remains a living, breathing testament to the enduring power of a loud guitar and an even louder spirit.